It's just
Okay. Hey, everybody. How are you all going? Hopefully everybody is well. I see some of our usual suspects here. Michael, Venerables from Santi, Korakot, Maggie, Gillian, Yingchen, Mitchell. So good to see you all. And good to see that we persevered because we've finally come to the end. And so now we're going to get the secret, which is how to get enlightened. That's all what you came here for. So that's excellent. And so we are now having completed a fairly broad-ranging survey of different aspects of epistemology across the different schools that are present in the time of the Buddha, as well as ideas and so on that are present within the Buddhist teachings. We sort of now come to what we regard more characteristically as being the Buddha's teachings themselves, which especially focus on the kinds of knowledge that arise from meditation, as well as the limits of such knowledge. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that I'm sitting on. So I'm sitting on the land of the Baramatigal people of the Darug Nation. And I pay homage to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I have gratitude for their custodianship of this land, which they looked after for such a long period of time. Now, when we're looking at Jayatileka's work, he has organized his chapters into, his ideas into various chapters. The last chapter, chapter 9, being the means and limits of knowledge. One of the characteristics, I guess, of Jayatileka's method is that his thoughts are fairly atomic. By that I mean that he has like these individual paragraphs or short sections that discuss different kinds of issues, but he is fairly, he's not that interested in sort of drawing them together in some kind of grand narrative or something like that. He's much more interested in looking at the specifics of different kinds of things. And in that way, you could say that this is emblematic of the empiricist approach to knowledge. Empiricists prefer to keep close to experience, to see what there is, and to remain fairly humble and cautious in what they can infer from those things. So I think that method that Jayatileka uses can, in many ways, be is a kind of authentic reflection of his own epistemological method. And while there is a obvious intellectual integrity in that, it also kind of exposes the weakness, I guess, of the empiricist approach, which is that sometimes you can end up with just atoms, end up with a pile of things sitting there, and you're not quite sure how they all sort of fit together. And that tends to be the problem with Jayatileka's work. It's sometimes hard to figure out like what is the overall point that he's trying to make, like where is he getting to with things. Like he does have an overall point, but he's not like shoving it in your face. He's not making it too obvious. I wanted to begin this week for that reason with a brief overview from the suttas that can draw together many of the different aspects which the Buddha speaks of. And that is from the Chanki Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 95. And in the Chanki Sutta, the Buddha is in conversation with a Brahmin, and he has a discussion about the way of finding knowledge. And he draws together a lot of the things that we have been discussing. So let me just read briefly from a couple of paragraphs in this sutta. So the discussion with the Brahman proceeds as such. The Buddha is speaking and he says to the Brahman, first you relied on faith, now you speak on oral tradition. These 5 things can be seen to turn out in 2 different ways. What 5? Faith, preference, oral tradition, reasoned contemplation, and acceptance of a view after consideration. And of course, we've seen these 5 things discussed previously in the course. Even though we have full faith in something, it may be void, hollow, and false. If you don't have full faith in something, it may be true, real, and not otherwise. Same thing if you have preference or if you contemplate or reason about something. So for a sensible person who is preserving truth, this is not sufficient to come to a definite conclusion. This is the only truth. Other ideas are silly, mogamanyang. So the Brahman asks the Buddha, how do you define the preservation of truth? So this is an important phrase here, the satyanurakha, right? The preservation of truth. And the preservation of truth is essentially the Wikipedia standard, which is that it's not saying that something is true, but it's saying that something can be referenced, or saying something that the statement that you make about the truth doesn't go beyond the bounds of the sources that you have for that truth. The Buddha replies, if a person has faith, they preserve truth by saying, such is my faith. But they don't yet come to the definite conclusion. This is the only truth. Other ideas are silly. If a person has a preference or has received an oral transmission or has a reasoned reflection about something or has accepted a view after contemplation, they preserve truth by saying, such is the view I have accepted after contemplation. But they don't yet come to the definite conclusion, this is the only truth, other ideas are silly. That's how there is the preservation. That's how the preservation of truth is defined, Bharadvaja. I describe the preservation of truth as defined in this way. But this is not yet the awakening to the truth. Okay, so that standard is a standard that, like I mentioned, the Wikipedia standard, but also if you're doing any kind of academic work or something like that, that you don't want to misrepresent your sources. You don't want to overstate your facts. And just that much, if we were to apply that standard to the things that we see and hear in casual conversation or in say on social media and so on, then this would already be more than enough to dismiss many of the things which we find echoing around the sphere of conversation, because so much of the time people take a little bit of evidence or a slight indication or something and then blow it up to make it mean something that it really doesn't. And the Brahman then responds, that's how the preservation of truth is defined, Master Gautama, but how do you define awakening to the truth? Satyanubodha. Bharadvaja, take the case of a mendicant living supported by a town or village. A householder or their child approaches and scrutinizes them for 3 kinds of things that arouse greed, that provoke hate, and that promote delusion. Does this venerable have any qualities that arouse greed or hate or delusion? Such qualities that were the mind to be overwhelmed by them, they might say that they know even though they don't know, or that they see even though they don't see, or that they might encourage others to do what is for their lasting harm and suffering. Scrutinizing them, they find this venerable has no such qualities. Rather, they have bodily and verbal behavior that is like someone without greed, hate, and delusion. And the Dhamma that they teach is deep, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful, sublime, beyond the scope of logic, subtle, comprehensible to the astute. It's not easy for someone with greed to teach this. So someone that goes with greed, hatred, and delusion. When they see that they are purified of qualities that promote greed, hate, and delusion, they place faith in them. When faith has arisen, they approach the teacher. They pay homage to the teacher. They lend an ear. They hear the teachings, they remember the teachings, reflect on the meaning, and accept them after consideration. So notice that in here, many of the things which were dismissed as being a source of knowledge are now included as being part of the way to knowledge. One of them being samano no garu, our teacher is respected. So here, somebody has respect for the teacher, but after scrutinizing them, they have faith, but that faith is conditional. They hear the teachings, but they don't just blindly believe anything based on oral tradition. They reflect on their meaning. They accept them after consideration, but they don't just blindly believe anything that they think. Now, once they've accepted them after consideration, then enthusiasm springs up. They make an effort, they weigh up, and they persevere. And by weighing up means basically the practice of insight. So to examine the truth of those teachings within themselves. Persevering, and that means continuing and deepening their meditation practice, they directly realize the ultimate truth and see it with penetrating wisdom. That's how the awakening to truth is defined, Bharadvaja. I describe the awakening to truth as defined in this way, but that is not yet the arrival at truth. Okay, so that's the awakening at truth, but not yet the arrival at truth. It seems a bit much, doesn't it? You've done all of this kind of stuff and you've reached this point and you've done all of these things and the Buddha's still not happy. What more could there be? The distinction that the Buddha is making here is in fact a very common distinction found throughout the suttas between the first realization of the truth, which we call stream entry, and the final realization of the truth, which we call arahantship. So that first yatabhuta jnana dassana, knowing and seeing things as they really are, this is usually equivalent to stream entry. And the final arrival at the truth, what is helpful for arrival at the truth by the development cultivation, making much of these very same things, there is the arrival at the truth. So that means for the stream enterer to then keep doing the same kinds of things. Then they will finally finish the path and arrive at the truth. So that's the chunky sutta. And it's one of those suttas which synthesizes that process of knowledge and learning. It brings together many of the things which elsewhere the Buddha was critical of, and then shows how those very same things, in fact, have a role to play in the realization of the truth. And so some of those things, which the reliance on authority, the faith, the oral tradition, and so on, all of these things have a role to play. The Buddha isn't meaning to say that we should ignore and throw these things out, but he is meaning to say, notice how that begins with a pretty harsh level of scrutiny, right? They go to the teacher and they subject their teacher to a lot of scrutiny. And I mean, I'm just guessing, but I'm guessing that most of the monastics on here are sitting there thinking, getting a bit nervous right now, and wondering who's going to be coming and scrutinizing them in that way, as we should be. So what that shows is that process of inquiry comes foremost, right? It's not that we accept first and then we inquire, but the process of inquiry is part of the accepting of that from the beginning. Okay, so that's giving a brief overview of the path of knowledge, which sort of in some way kind of knits together a lot of the things that Jayati Lake has been talking about. Let's return to the last chapter, and I'm going to read from the last chapter. And it's a very rich chapter. There's a lot of different parts in it. I went through and made a note of the different paragraphs I wanted to read, and then I realized that it was all of them. So I'm trying to sort of cut out some of them because it probably will take a bit long, but we'll see if we can focus on the most important bits. Let us start from the beginning. And as always, please do put your questions in the chat and I will answer them from time to time. In this final chapter, we propose to examine the means and limits of knowledge as recognized in the Pali canonical texts. And this is now paragraph 713. In chapter 4, we noticed that when the Buddha classified his predecessors and contemporaries, in respect of the ways of knowledge emphasized by them as the traditionalists, the rationalists, and the experientialists. He identified himself as a member of the last group. In his address to the Kalamas and to Bhadalichavi, where he criticizes 6 ways of knowing based on authority and 4 ways of knowing based on reason, as we have just seen also in the Chanki Sutta, on the ground that beliefs based on authority of reason may turn out to be true or false, he ends on the note that one should accept a proposition as true only when one has personal knowledge, atana wa janayata, of it, taking into account the views of the wise. And that is something which is worth bearing in mind. In the Kalama Sutta and elsewhere, the views of the wise are still taken into consideration. Okay, now paragraph 714, this emphasis on personal and direct knowledge is found throughout the Nikayas. And in trying to determine the ways of knowing recognized by the canon, it is necessary to see clearly what was meant by this kind of knowledge. 715, the fact that the Buddha claimed to be one of those recluses and Brahmins who had a higher personal knowledge of a doctrine not yet found among doctrines traditionally handed down, it is clear evidence that the Buddha did not claim or consider himself to have a unique way of knowing denied to others. It ranks him in his own estimate as a member of a class of recluses and Brahmins who claim to have a personal and higher knowledge of doctrines. Who could these recluses and Brahmins be in the light of our knowledge of the historical background? So of the 3 types of Brahmanical thinkers, paragraph 716, the traditionalists of the Vedas and Brahmas, the rationalists of the early Upanishads, and the experientialists of the middle and late Upanishads. Since the Buddha dissociates himself from the first 2 classes, we may presume that he identifies himself, among others, with the Brahman thinkers of the middle and late Upanishads. From the time of the early Upanishads, newly discovered doctrines not found in traditional Vedic learning were being taught. Swetaketu had learned all the Vedas, Sarvam Vedan Aditya, but had to be instructed by Uddalaka with the doctrine whereby what he has not heard is heard. Yenasrutang srutang bhavati. That's in the Chandogya Upanishad. And so that is very similar to the idea that we find in the Dhammacakkappavattana, Pubbesu and Anusutesu Dhammesu. Such doctrines, as well as the doctrines constituting the higher knowledge of the middle and late Upanishads, have to be reckoned among the doctrines not traditionally handed down. In paragraph 717, we've observed that these latter thinkers claimed a kind of knowledge which was matter of directly seeing or intuiting ultimate reality, and which was usually described by the word jnana. In a sense, the emphasis on jnana or knowledge was common to all the Upanishadic thinkers, since knowledge came to be valued as the means of salvation, at least from the time of the Aranyakas onwards. Thenceforth, there was a cleavage in the Vedic tradition between the karma marga, or the way of ritual, and the jnana marga, or the way of knowledge. Early Buddhism is aware of this distinction, for the Sutta Nipata mentions the Yajnapada, or the way of ritual, as against the Jnanapada, or the way of knowledge. But it is also necessary to emphasize the distinction between the 2 ways of knowledge recognized within the Upanishads, the intellectual or rational knowledge of the early Upanishads and the intuitive knowledge of the middle and late Upanishad. Of these 2, it is the latter way of knowing that Buddhism values. There is more evidence that Buddhism recognized the validity of the means of knowledge upheld by this latter class of thinkers, though its valuation of it and what was known by it was not the same. We note that jnana was upheld in the middle and late Upanishads, where knowledge was described as one seeing. In the Nikayas, it is said that the Buddha is a jnana vadin, or a jnanin. He is described as one who knowing knows and seeing sees, having become sight and knowledge. The knowing and seeing one is a characteristic description of the Buddha, and it is usually said of what he claims to be know that he both knows and sees. The central truths of Buddhism are seen. One comprehends the noble truths and sees them. Arya Satchani Avecha Pasati. Even nirvana is seen in a sense analogous to the seeing of a man born blind after a physician has treated him. The Buddha is one who has knowledge and insight into all things. And the religious life is lived under the exalted one for the knowledge, insights, attainment, realization, and comprehension of what is not known, not seen. And many other examples can be given, which emphasize the centrality of that idea of knowing and seeing in the suttas. But what exactly do we mean by that? What are we talking about when we say knowing and seeing? Why this emphasis on these twofold aspects of cognition? Paragraph 719. There is no doubt that knowledge and insight, or knowing and seeing in the above sense, is mainly, though not exclusively, a byproduct of samadhi, as Jayatileka translates it, mental concentration in jhana or yoga. It is said that there is a causal relation between the attainment of samadhi and the emergence of this knowledge and insight. This shows that it is qualitatively similar to the Upanishadic knowing and seeing, which is also a result of dhyana. So one of the words for jnana is dhyayamana. This kind of direct intuitive knowledge was also claimed by some of the Ajivikas and the Jains. Okay, I'm now going to skip ahead a little bit to paragraph 724. In the Upanishads, one's knowledge and vision is not, in the final analysis, due to one's efforts, but to the grace or intervention of Atman or God. I'm not sure if that's entirely correct, but we'll just leave that for now. But the emergence of this knowledge is conceived as something inexplicable and mysterious. This character warrants it being called a kind of mystical knowledge. But in the Buddhist account, the mental concentration or samadhi, which is a product of training and effort, is a causal factor in the production of the knowledge. And he goes on to quote from the suttas, in the absence of right samadhi, in the case of one not endowed with right samadhi, the cause is absent for the knowledge and vision of things as they really are. It is a natural and not supernatural occurrence. It is in the nature of things, dhammata, that a person in the state of samadhi knows and sees what really is. A person who knows and sees what really is does not need to make an effort of will to feel disinterested and renounce. It is in the nature of things that a person who knows and sees as it really is feels disinterested and renounces, and so on and so forth up to enlightenment. And this is, there are, of course, a number of suttas in the Nikayas that speak in similar ways. So the point here being that the arising of knowledge, knowing, and seeing is a natural phenomena that arises from a causal process where we can understand what those causes are, as opposed to a mysterious and mystical intervention. As I intimated earlier, I'm not sure I entirely agree with Jayatileka that the arising of insight in the Upanishads is purely a mystical event. I think the Upanishads are less clear in the way that they describe these things. And I think the one of the innovations of the Buddha was to describe meditation and meditative insight in a way that was much more clear and comprehensible. But I don't know, I think that that's a slightly alien way of thinking, to think of the Upanishads in terms of relying on intervention by the grace of God for the sake of insight. God is not something that is external to you. That's kind of the whole point in the Upanishads. Anyway, look, I won't go too much into that, because we're not here to discuss Upanishadic epistemology. All right, moving ahead. Paragraph 725, this difference, if we can compare Purana Kassapa, one of the non-Buddhist thinkers at the time, and the Buddha, both claim to be in the same class of thinkers on epistemological grounds. They're both Jnanavadins. But Purana holds that there is no cause or condition for the lack of knowledge or insight, and there's no cause and condition for the presence of knowledge and insight. Where the Buddha said that there was a cause and condition for these things. So Jayati Lake is making the point here that while there are many different schools or branches of ascetics, seekers, philosophers who emphasized on knowing and seeing, they weren't all the same. They emphasized knowing and seeing on different grounds and for different reasons. And the Buddha's emphasis was always on causality. Paragraph 726. In outlining the causes and conditions for the emergence or non-emergence of this kind of knowledge, it is said, when one dwells with one's mind obsessed with and given to passion, and one does not truly know and see the elimination of the passion that has arisen, it is a cause of one's failure to know and see. And likewise with ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and remorse and doubt. On the other hand, the cultivation of the 7 factors of enlightenment, the Sattabodhanga, is said to be a cause and condition for the arising of knowledge and insight. Paragraph 727, the 5 factors outlined above as what causes the lack of knowledge and insight are in fact the same as what is commonly known in the Pali Nikayas as the 5 impediments or pancha nivarana. According to the Buddhist theory, the elimination of these 5 factors is said to clear the way for the development of the jhanas or the meditative states of mind. When these 5 impediments are eliminated, or 5 hindrances, they're usually translated, he looks within himself and gladness arises in him. With gladness, joy. With his mind overjoyed, his mind becomes at ease, and with his body at ease, he experiences happiness. Being happy, his mind becomes concentrated, and then goes through the different jhanas. I'll just note in passing here that the word nivarana, we usually translate as hindrances. Jayati Leka has impediments, but the root meaning of nivarana stems back to the Vritra, who is the cosmic serpent or the dragon. And the serpent or the dragon wrapped the world around in his coils like a python, squeezing the world and crushing the world and enveloping the world in darkness. And so the root of the etymology here is not so much as an impediment, as in something that's stopping your progress, but the root of the metaphor is something that's wrapping around you and shrouding you in darkness so that you can't see. And so this is one of the reasons why getting rid of the hindrances, it clears the way for the arising of wisdom. So I think that's a really nice etymology for the idea of the nivarana. The nivaranas are like a serpent of darkness that wraps your mind and crushes your knowing. Certainly, that's how I feel when I'm experiencing. I don't know about you guys, but anyway. All right. Moving along. Okay. Jhanas. Okay, so Jayati Leka then notes that once the jhanas have been attained up to the 4th jhana, that one turns one's mind to the realization of the 6 abhinya, the 6 direct knowledges or higher knowledges, which we are going to look at in just a moment. So the abhinya are certain kinds of knowing that are only accessible to those who have mastered the high levels of jhana, especially 4th jhana. Paragraph 728, Jayati Leka says, we note here the operation of a causal process. The elimination of the impediments makes the mind concentrated in meditation, and this in turn makes it possible for it to have knowledge and insight of things as they are. This is why it is often said that mental concentration is the cause of knowing and seeing things as they really are. One first obtains the attainment of virtue. This is followed by the attainment of samadhi, and consequently by the attainment of knowledge and insight. I will skip ahead a couple of paragraphs to paragraph 732, the 5 impediments constituting the emotional factors as well as mental and physical lassitude not only prevent the mind from being concentrated and thus affect the emergence of jhanic perception, but affect our cognitive faculties even in normal consciousness. A Brahman named Sangarava comes to the Buddha and asks the question, what is the cause and reason why at times even hymns which have been recited for a long period do not clearly appear before one's memory, not to speak of hymns not so recited, while at other times even hymns not recited for a long time are easily remembered, let alone hymns recited for a long time. It's replied that this happens when the mind is affected by one or more of the 5 hindrances which tend to cause forgetfulness. And as we are right now coming up to the HSCs, then this is a very important piece of information for all of our students, right? The reason you can't remember stuff is not because you need to stay up all night banging your head against books. It's because your mind has hindrances. And sometimes the more that you the more you try to cram, the more you just get tired and frustrated and all of those kinds of things, which is actually just making your hindrances worse. And better off to be relaxed, to be peaceful, to be well rested, and to do some meditation. And then that clears your mind and reduces the hindrances. And it means that the knowledge that you already have will come to the fore more clearly. And this whole process of learning, like we've seen in the Chunky Sutta, this is such a good guidance for study and for education. And one of the things that it really emphasizes is the active engagement in the learning at the time when you are learning, not just sitting there passively letting everything wash over you, but scrutinizing, inquiring, reminding yourself, going over it again. And that active engagement with the learning when it is fresh is what really helps to etch that learning deep in your mind. And if you do that at the time, listen carefully, listen with mindfulness, inquire, make sure you clarify the meanings, remind yourself afterwards, what is it that I learned? Go over it a couple of times. Then you'll find that with a fairly minimal amount of effort like that, that the memory and the retention will increase hugely. And then through meditation, your mind stays clear and that knowledge will be accessible. And that is, I think, a really effective educational approach rather than well, I don't know, I think a lot of people, they're like you, just sort of drift off and don't pay attention during the class, and then you try to catch up later and then spend all your time trying to learn the things that you should have learned the first time. But maybe that's just me. Okay, moving on. Where are we now? 34. Okay. Yeah. Paragraph 734, the Jaitileka makes the point that the kind of knowledge or learning that we have is necessary but not sufficient. And even that goes so far as to the insight through meditation. And insight through meditation is not the point. Insight and meditation is just another step. The point is freedom from suffering. So the jnana darsana, knowing and seeing, is what gets us towards the end of suffering, but it's not the final point. Okay, paragraph 735. There is yet another difference, which is apparent in the early Buddhist attitude towards the data of intuitive experience, which differentiates it from the middle and late Upanishadic thinkers. The Buddhists considered it possible to misinterpret this experience and draw erroneous inferences from it. We thus find that Buddhism does not make the claim of the mystic that this knowledge was derived from a supernatural source in an unaccountable manner, but that it is the product of the natural development of the mind and due to the operation of causal processes. It does not regard the content of this experience as identical with ultimate reality, Buddhism also believes that erroneous influences could be drawn from these experiences. At the same time, it does not decry normal perception, but like the materialists, draws many of its conclusions on the basis of it. It would be misleading to call this mystical or intuitive knowledge in the context of Buddhism in view of the utterly different attitude to and evaluation for it. We shall therefore refer to this kind of knowledge as extrasensory perception in the Buddhist context. So this one is a very important point, and we will go and see some examples of how that happens later on. But this kind of thing we see constantly throughout Buddhism these days, where people will have some kind of meditative experience and then will draw some inference from that experience, but without really evaluating it, without really criticizing it, without really looking too deeply into it. And people will then assume that this experience is some kind of vision of ultimate reality, and they will then found a new school of Buddhism on the basis of it, and it happens all the time. So the Buddha said that meditative experience is essential, but by itself and without all of those other things that we've talked about, without the reliance on a good teacher or kalyana mitta, without some faith, without the oral learning, without all of those things that give meaning and context to your experience, then what tends to happen is that the experience itself may be pure. Right? When you have an experience, it's just the experience. There's nothing wrong with that experience. But afterwards, what was that? Janami. Ahang janami. Ahang janami, ahang pasami. I am the one who knows. I am the one who sees. Yes, I am the one. I. And then, well, then we go down that little rabbit hole once more. Okay. So from paragraph 736, when it was said that this knowledge was to be had personally or individually, it is necessary to point out that what it meant is not that this knowledge was incommunicable or subjective. The primary reason for the frequent use of samang to qualify the verbs from drish in these contexts seems to be, that means samang means individually, seeing, seems to be to emphasize the fact that this knowledge is to be had by directly seeing oneself, and not indirectly by hearing it from other source. And so, sorry, just skipping over the rest of that paragraph. The rest of that paragraph gives some illustrations of that. Okay. Paragraph 738. 738, the Buddhist theory of truth also makes it clear that truth and therefore knowledge is objective, as telling us the nature of things as they are. The knowledge of things as they are consists in knowing what exists as existing and what does not exist as not existing. The quote from the Anguttara Nikaya, santang va atti pi nyasati, santang va natti pi nyasati. Knowing things as they are, it is said, wherever they are is the highest knowledge. What is taught by the Buddha is claimed to be objectively valid. Whether the Tathagata preaches the Dhamma to his disciples or does not preach it, the Dhamma remains the same. So here Jayatileka is advancing this idea of the objectivity of knowledge. I'm personally a bit uncomfortable with the idea of using the word objective in this kind of context. Certainly the Buddha ruled out purely subjective ways of knowing. Okay, so and actually I'm just translating one of the suttas, the Chulavyuha Sutta in the Sutta Nipata Varga of the Sutta Nipata, which deals with this very topic. And there the Buddha very emphatically says, Ekan hi satchang nadutiyamati, that the truth is one and there is no second, and no wise person would disagree with this. So clearly the Buddha is ruling out the idea that each person can have their own pacceka satcha, their own individual truth. And so Jayatilleke refers to this as objective truth. The problem with objective truth is it gets you into a kind of metaphysical implication that there's some kind of objective reality, which is a kind of problematic area. Perhaps intersubject, because all of the experiences and the whole scope of Buddhism is within the scope of the Four Noble Truths, which means it's within the scope of experience. So it's, yes, but we all share that experience. This is the point. The point is not that it's objectively true, but the point is that it's true wherever it's experienced. So every sentient being experiences suffering, and every sentient being experiences suffering, which has a cause. And so in that sense, we can share that understanding and we can discuss it. And that is not dependent on whether the Buddha arises or not. It's whether the Buddha arises or not, there is still the experience of suffering among sentient beings. So this is really what Jayatilleke is pointing to here when he's using the word objective, rather than getting involved in kind of a metaphysical statement about ontology. All right. Okay. Next paragraph also makes another very important point, and there's so many really interesting and important points that Jayatilleke is making. Each paragraph here needs careful attention. The next one is the importance of eliminating subjective bias and of getting rid of habits of the mind that cause people to fall into error is often stressed. It was the skeptics who paid the greatest attention to this subject. The first school of skeptics said that truth cannot be arrived at and was always a subjective factor such as attachment, passion, hate, or repulsion, which make one accept a proposition as true. That's like such a modern attitude. And you see this so many times where especially on social media and places like that people will use a reductive argument to say, well, you're biased, therefore what you say can't be true. Therefore, if you have a bias, then what you say cannot be anything but the expression of your bias. Right? So we don't have to listen to you. And that kind of attitude is an extreme and nihilistic skepticism. And it is completely lacking in compassion, because compassion says, I understand you as a human being with your preferences and losses and sadnesses and wishes and regrets. And as a human being, this is what has meaning for you. And we inform our statements and our wisdom due to our experiences. Our experiences, this kind of idea that somehow if we were to strip humanity away from knowledge, we could end up with an objective reality is just kind of crazy. That's not how knowledge arises. And knowledge arises because we care, because we suffer, and we look for a solution for it because it matters to us. And so we can't we on the one hand, we need to acknowledge that, yes, of course, we do have those biases, and those biases can and often do lead us astray. Absolutely. They cause us to frame certain questions in certain ways. They cause us to omit looking at certain kinds of responses. They cause us to value certain kinds of authorities and dismiss other kinds of authorities, and so on and so forth. But that's all comprehensible. We can learn about that, how that works. We can learn how our own biases work, and we can learn to compensate for that. And we can, for example, deliberately seek out people who have a different point of view to ours. And this is something that I do constantly. And if as many of you will know, one of my hobby courses is climate change. And I've been reading articles on climate change probably pretty much every day for the last 10 or 15 years. And every single time when I look into my regular sources in The Guardian and various other places, and you see articles from time to time that say, actually, we don't really need to worry about climate change so much. And every single time when I see an article like that, I go, great. Let's see what they have to say. And then when I read them, I'm like, no, actually, I wish you were right. I want you to be right, but I'm just not persuaded, unfortunately. So this is how we can be. So if anybody, by the way, does know of something like that that's going to make me stop worrying about climate change so much, please send it along my way. I will gladly have a look at it, and hopefully it will be right. But yeah, anyway. So this is how we need to deal, the subjectivity of our response to the truth should be dealt with through compassion. This is when you're dealing with people, especially when you're dealing with people online. This is a tell. This is one of the ways that you can tell that conversation is not going to proceed well. If somebody uses your bias and your perspective to dismiss you and not hear what you have to say, then you know that it's unlikely that you're going to have a good conversation with this person, because they lack compassion. Yeah. So this is one of the really interesting tells. Okay. Continuing in paragraph 739, the difference from skepticism in Buddhism, it doesn't result in total skepticism regarding the possibility of truth. One's emotions, whether it be one's likes and dislikes, can distort the truth, and the Buddha warns disciples about this. On the other hand, sorry, I'm just skipping over some of the longer quotes here. Even when the Buddha was extravagantly praised by Sariputta, the Buddha says, "Look, how can you say that? What's the basis that you're saying that on?" Even though Sariputta is obviously speaking out of faith and out of joy and confidence in the Buddha. So the Jaitileka comments that this incident displays the basically objective attitude of the Buddha, who demanded that for statements to be significant and true, they must be based on evidence that warrants their assertion and not on the grounds of our subjective prejudices. Number 740, paragraph 740, it goes on, the impact of desire on belief is clearly recognized in Buddhism. Again, a really important statement, the influence of desire on belief. And this is one of the reasons why this whole kind of idea of objectivity of knowledge is so fraught. And it's something that I see constantly when working in the digital area, working with programmers and so on, is that programmers have this conceit that their knowledge is objective and what they're doing is objective. Computers are objective. They just put in an input and they get the output. It's just, there's no subjectivity to what they're doing. And so many people have sort of invested so much into this idea that this is what computers are doing. But that's not what computers are doing at all. That's like the furthest from the truth about what computers actually do. The very first thing that any programmer does when they open up a file and start to write a program is ask themselves, what do I want? That's it. Every single line of code in every single program is because some programmer wanted it to be like that. And every single program is designed in order to satisfy desire. And so the whole apparatus that we built up of computing and digital infrastructure and all of those things is a tool for satisfying human desire. And it is not an objective thing at all. Okay. One of the causal statements made is that on account of desire, there is clinging, tanha paccaya upadana. This clinging is described as fourfold. Here, obviously, we're in the realm of dependent origination, clinging to sense pleasures, to rituals, to metaphysical beliefs, and to soul or substance theories. We are here only concerned with the latter two. This means that we believe in certain metaphysical theories because we are impelled by our desires to believe in them. These desires are threefold: the desire for sense gratification, the desire for personal immortality, bhavatanha, and the desire for annihilation, or the desire for annihilation, or the desire for power. I don't think that's the second one is correct, but anyway. And just something just to note in passing, that when reading Jaitileka's work, for example, we have the rendering here of bhavatanha as desire for personal immortality. And for those of you familiar with the suttas, we'll often see that bhavatanha is desire for craving for becoming, as some people say, or craving for existence. right? And the problem with these kinds of renderings is that a lot of translators, because we choose very literal rendering, doesn't actually convey the meaning of it very well. And Jayatileka's approach to these things is less literal, but he gets the meaning of it almost always exactly right. And here the meaning is, what Bhavatanha means, is the desire to be immortal. It's the desire to continue to exist, the desire to live again. Anyway, yes, so anyway, Jayatileka makes the point that our desire to achieve any of these aims will shape the theories and the views that we have. And the inclusion of Vibhava Tanha in there is interesting, desire for annihilation, because one of the criticisms of belief in rebirth is that belief in rebirth is wish fulfillment, that we only believe that we're going to get reborn because we want to keep on living and we want to go somewhere where we can be happy in the future life. And obviously, there's some truth to that, right? That's obviously that's part of the equation which needs to be taken into consideration. At the same time, though, it's also true that the desire to not exist is also a fundamental part of human psychology. And the desire to just make it all stop and make it all go away is also a super powerful kind of desire. And the Buddha is acknowledging this as well. So those who don't believe in rebirth are also susceptible to this kind of bias. All right. And the way that the Buddha talks about these kind of, when the Buddha talks about this kind of knowledge, he often uses phrases and expressions that are almost ridiculously plain, so that you look at them and you think, what is he talking about? For example, one of the passages he says, there are some ascetics who abide by day perceiving that it's night, and who abide by night perceiving that it's day. I'm not one of those. When it's day, I know it's day, and when it's night, I know it's night. And you read that and you think, okay, good, but not particularly special, right? I mean, that's a fairly ordinary kind of knowledge. But this is the point that the Buddha is making. And if you've hung around with meditation and spiritual circles for long enough, you'll begin to realize that these kinds of things are actually not that uncommon. And people who will say that reality is exactly upside down are kind of a dime a dozen. Another example here is the Jayatileka quotes, just as one person would review another person standing would view a person seating, or a person seated would view a person lying down. And so this, again, this kind of just straightforward, clear clarity of seeing things, or in the great simile for viewing the Four Noble Truths, just like a man would stand on the side of a pond that's clear and still, and would watch the fish swimming around the pond and settling, and watch the weeds growing. And it's that emphasis on that simple, clear, straightforward of knowing things as they are. Okay. Again, skipping ahead a few paragraphs here. Right. So there's some more discussions here on the topic of vijnana and the nature of vijnana and relationship with some different cognitive terms in the suttas. And that's some paragraph, more or less paragraph 743 forward to 744 or something. That's an interesting discussion, but I won't go into it because it will take us too long, unfortunately. Let us return to the topic of the abhinya, paragraph 752. The word abhinya, as the PTS dictionary states, has an older and wider meaning of a special supernormal power of apperception and knowledge to be acquired by long training in life and thought. Later, it exclusively means one of the 6 powers, all of which are mentioned in all strata of the Pali Canon. They are claimed to have been attained by the Buddha as well as by his disciples. It is said that out of 500 monks, 60 have attained this 6-fold higher knowledge. The 6 are as follows. The number 1, Idhi Vidha, which is psychokinesis, Dibasota, clairaudience, Cheto Pariyajnana, telepathic knowledge, telepathy. Pubbenivasa Anusatiñana, the retrocognitive, the recollection of past lives. Dibbajaku, clairvoyance. And the Asavakayajnana, the knowledge of the destruction or the ending of defiling impulses. And I'll just make a note here, having said that Jayatileka's renderings are usually very reliable. I don't agree with the translation here of kaya as destruction. And I also differ with Bhikkhu Bodhi on this one. Kaya doesn't mean destruction. It means the waning of the moon, or the drying up of a stream, or the using up of supplies of food, all of which are much gentler and more natural than destruction, which is, I'm going to get a piece of wood and smash them to bits. So destruction, I use just ending in these cases, the ending of the defilements. All right, so these are the 6 abhinyas. Obviously, out of these 6 abhinyas, only the last one is the one which is really critical to enlightenment. But nevertheless, all of them are mentioned very frequently, and all of them have a role to play in Buddhism. The first is the not a cognitive power, but more of manifesting the powers of will. So it doesn't have to have so much to do with epistemology, so I'll leave it aside. So the 4 in the middle, 4 kinds of abhinya, are they're called the specific forms of knowledge. Sorry, I'm just... So Jayatileka points out that we can see 2 different aspects of telepathic knowledge in the suttas. One is more by reflecting on the state or the nature of a person's mind, so that you can see whether their mind is full of greed or lacking greed and so on. So you're having an impression or an understanding of the overall state of a person's mind. And the other one, which is interesting, but that is spoken of much less often, is the idea that you can actually read a person's thoughts. And it's kind of interesting the way that that's described in the suttas, as if there's some kind of almost like a physical ability to recognize the reflection of the thoughts that a person has. But again, I won't go into those in too much, but we'll move on to the 3-fold knowledge, the Tiso Vijja. Each of these is said to have occurred as a result, usually, of the 4th jhana. And he recollects his manifold past existences: 1 birth, 2 birth, many periods of world evolution and dissolution. I was in such a place with such a person and family name, with such a status, such and such food, such and such experiences, and such a term of life. Dying there, I was reborn there. There too, I had such and such a name, and dying there, I was reborn here. Thus, he recollects his manifold past lives in their aspects and details. And this is compared to a person going on a journey from a village to village, being able to recall the details of his journey. And once again, like the point here is the clarity and the detail of this recollection. Now, we know from experiences that have been related in the present day that there are not a few people who are able to recollect their past life, especially children. And there are many accounts, thousands of accounts of people who are able to do that. And it's one of the better studied areas in terms of testing and validating these kinds of experiences. but the recollection that the Buddha is speaking of, because it is purified by the fourth jhana, has a quality of purity and clarity which is unparalleled. The next one is clairvoyance, or the Dibbachaku, and that is directed towards the knowledge of the decease and survival of beings and acquiring an understanding of karma. With his clear paranormal clairvoyant vision, he sees beings dying and being reborn, the low and the high, the fair and the ugly, the good and the evil, each according to his karma. It's also by this means that one sees contemporaneous events beyond the ken of normal vision, so you can see what's happening in other parts of the world. And finally, the last of the threefold higher knowledges, one is able to know verify the Four Noble Truths, as well as the origin and cessation of the asavas, the corruptions or the defilements. He knows this is the truth of suffering, this is the cause of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, this is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. These are the defiling impulses, this is the cause of the defiling impulses, this is the cessation, and this is the path leading to their cessation. When we see such formulations in the suttas, those two stages reflect, as I commented earlier, the two main stages in the realization of enlightenment. The first one being stream entry, the second one being arahantship. So a stream enterer sees the Four Noble Truths, they see suffering, the origin, the ending of suffering, and the path, whereas an arahant sees the full ending of the defilements, and with that their mind is freed. So this is why we see that repeated structure in those ways. They're not just saying the same thing, but they are repeating those things as well. Sorry, they're talking about those two different levels. Okay, along with paragraph 757, along with perception, both normal and paranormal seems to have gone inference, anumana. The word anumana appears in the sense of inference in the Anumana Sutta. The principle is laid down that one should not do unto others what one does not wish others to do unto you, aka the golden rule. This is said to be based on the knowledge that what is generally disliked by oneself is likely to be disliked by others as well, and this knowledge is said to be due to an inference. But here one should oneself infer anumanitabbang as follows. An evil person who is swayed by evil thoughts is disagreeable to me and disliked by me. Now, if I were to be evil and swayed by evil thoughts, I too would be disagreeable and disliked by others. So this embodies those two inferences. Number one, I dislike an evil person. X, i.e. any person other than me is like me as a person. Therefore, X probably dislikes an evil person. We also meet with the term anvaya jnanam, meaning inductive knowledge, in both the Nikayas as well as the Abhidhamma. By this is meant the inferential inductive knowledge that a causal sequence or concomitance observed to hold good in a number of present instances would have taken place in the unobserved past and will take place in the future. In the Samyutta Nikaya are described a number of causally correlated phenomena, such as with the arising of birth, there is the arising of decay and death, and with the cessation of birth is the cessation of decay and death. And then this constitutes the knowledge of phenomena. By seeing, experiencing, acquiring knowledge before long and delving into those phenomena, he draws an inference, nayang neti, with regard to the past and the future, as follows. Everyone who understood it in the past will understand it in the same way. Everyone who understands it in the future will understand it in the same way. These inductive inferences are based on a belief in causation, which plays a central role in the thought of the Pali Canon. And Jayatileka then introduces a discussion of dependent origination, which I will not go into here because once more it will be too much. Now we've covered a lot of ground already, and let us have a bit of a break here. But I just want to, just before we have the break, I just want to reiterate this last point that Jayatileka is making about the importance of inference. Inference is much maligned, especially in the present day theories of knowledge, which you find people talking about in Buddhism, much of which comes ultimately, I believe, from Zen and even from Krishnamurti. Whereas in traditional Buddhist epistemology of all schools of epistemology, inference is regarded as having a central role in realizing the truth and realizing the Dhamma. These days, you'll quite possibly hear a lot of different kinds of teachers who say just present moment only, that's all that matters. And but that's not what the Buddha was teaching, as we saw right then, and it's not how understanding can work. We can only, the present moment is just atoms. The present moment is just something that just is there. If we want to connect that present with the past and with the future, to understand the flow of things, understand the process of causality, we need to infer. We don't have any choice. It's just how it works. We don't know what happened a moment ago. We only know what is happening now. And if even to perceive impermanence must require inference, because you can't see in the present something being impermanent. All you can see is that this thing is there or it isn't there. That's all. Is it there? Sure, I can see it. Is it not there? I can see it. Was it there a second ago? I don't know. How do you know that? I can't see that. I can only infer that based on my memory. I can't see impermanence without inference. I can see suffering without inference, right? I can see that I'm experiencing pain, right? So I can see suffering to that degree, but I still can't see suffering in an existential context. I mean, all I can see is that this moment here is suffering. I can't see, well, maybe the next moment I won't have suffering, right? I can't see that. I can't see that all beings are suffering. I can't see that birth is going to produce suffering. I can only infer those things. And so the role of inference in terms of how the mind puts together the kind of knowledge is essential in the arising of insight in Buddhism. Now, that inference arises drawing on the experiential knowledge. So what happens is that our minds are natural, our minds are like our inference creating devices. Our minds are looking for patterns. They are built to do that. They are built to create meaning. That's what they do. They are built to knit this moment into the last moment and to predict the moment ahead. That's why we have minds, so that we can have some kind of understanding of things outside of the immediate experience. So our minds will naturally make these kinds of inferences. But one of the critical parts of our way of knowing is to ensure that we're making the right kinds of inferences. And that's why we have a critical understanding of faith and reason and authority and all of these things, because they all too easily will lead our mind to premature and unwarranted inferences. So we come back as much as possible to rely on experience, to come back and relying ourselves that what is this feeling? What is this perception? What is this experience? What is actually happening now? And we keep on coming back to that again and again and again and again, checking and rechecking, again, much like a scientist would do. Right? And so a scientist, if we want to know it's hot today, is it hot because of global warming? Well, most of us would probably say, yeah, probably, or maybe not. And that'll be about it. But a scientist will say, no, let's go back and review the evidence. Let's check up all the data. Let's go back and look at it one after one after one after one. And they will look in excruciating and painfully specific detail all of the different information that they want to do. And they will do that because they are aware of the fact that our subjective biases, our desires and our beliefs are so easily lead us into making premature claims. And this is why the knowledge from expertise is really valuable, because we can't just do that all the time. Like, we can't just learn all of medicine and all of climate science and all of engineering and all of quantum physics and all of those kinds of things. We have to rely on the detailed analytical knowledge of experts in those particular fields, who come to their inferences slowly and who are ready to abandon their inferences when the evidence changes. So this is the attitude that we bring into our mind. Now, by inference, the thing about inference, and Jayati doesn't really go into this, but the thing about inference is that it just happens. And even though, yes, we can identify that there are causal conditions behind it, right? It's conditioned by our desires, by our expectations, by our experience. But the inference either happens or it doesn't happen. And when it happens, we can't really say why. It's just there. And this fundamental aspect of knowledge is really quite almost irreducibly unknowable. And for all the emphasis on causality and conditions and systems and so on we find in the suttas, we also find an acknowledgement of that. I washed my feet and the water sank into the ground. And as it did that, my mind was freed. I went into my room and blew out the lamp, and with going out of the lamp, my mind was freed. How does that work? Yeah, that's how intuition arises. That's how that inference arises. It doesn't mean that that's all you have to do, right? It doesn't mean that forget the rest of the Eightfold Path and just go into your room and turn out your lamp and hope for the best. Okay, so this is not what it's saying. It's saying that that moment when all of these conditions ripen and they come to fruition, something happens. And it happens kind of behind the scenes. You don't know, you just know that that intuition is there. And when that comes, that doesn't mean that's the end of our critical and scrutinizing mind, because we then have what the Buddha called the Paccavekkhana jnana, is the reviewing, which also is very essential, that we go back and we still test that intuition, because not all intuitions are right. Okay, intuitions can also be wrong. Like they feel right, but they still need to be tested. Okay, let's do just a few minutes of meditation, and then I will look at some of your questions you've put in the chat. Okay, 7:50. Okay, let's have a look at some of the questions that you have. All right. Okay, so Vijita asks if I can make a comparison between the Western empiricism and knowing and seeing in the Buddha's teachings. I think Jayati actually does that at one point. I'm not sure if we will cover that exact passage, but the basic difference is that for Western empiricism relies purely on the 5 external senses and what can be inferred from those 2 things. So this is the basic idea of empiricism, is you stay close to your sense experience and on what can be reliably inferred from that sense experience. That's really the idea of empiricism. And that the conclusions that you draw from that inference can be then tested and checked with your sense experience. So in that sense, it's similar. But the difference is that the Buddha allowed for the development of the mind, the citta bhavana, the expansion of the capabilities of the mind. And then that leads to the kinds of extrasensory perceptions that we saw before. And one of Jayati innovations, and one of the great points that he makes, is that for the Buddha, that these are not mystical knowledges. These are conditioned realities of the mind, and that are just part of the natural causal process of the mind. Under certain causes and conditions, has access to certain kinds of knowledge that were otherwise unknown. And so the Buddha doesn't. The Buddha doesn't dismiss those as being non-empirical. And I think this is one of the really important points that Jayati is making. Interestingly enough, around the same time as Jayati was writing, or even a little bit earlier, was the famous computer scientist, Alan Turing. Now, Alan Turing created much of the foundation for computers as we know them today, that the computers as we use today are what is called Turing machines. And I've already mentioned Alan Turing in the context of the halting problem, the idea that we can't decide whether a problem can be solved or not before we've started computing the problem, one of the fundamental constraints of modern computers. But Alan Turing is also known for the Turing test, which is a test for the consciousness of computers. And his test for the consciousness of computers was essentially that if you can have a conversation with it and you can't tell whether it's human or not, then you more or less have to assume that it's conscious. And I mean, whether that's kind of interesting test, and it's still very relevant today. How meaningful it is, well, debatable. But one of the things which is usually omitted in the history of the Turing test is that Alan Turing put a footnote in his essay when he talks about this, where he said that if it can be proved that there is extrasensory perception of reading the minds of others, then potentially that you could read the mind of the computer, and then you could know that directly. So this is kind of an interesting little note that Alan Turing says, and he's not saying that you can do that. He's saying that from a philosophical point of view, if you could do it, then it would be a valid form of empirical knowledge. So yeah, interesting. Okay, Korakot notes that truth here seems to mean the transcendent experience of Nibbana as truth, not just something true. I mean, there's a spectrum, right? In some cases, yes, that's true, and the Nibbana is the ultimate truth in the sense that delusion is ended, so that the perception or the understanding of Nibbana is completely free of any kind of distortion. So yeah, Pravin, how's it going, Pravin? Is the relationship between knowing and seeing the same as that of knowledge and conduct? As in the Upavana Sutta, does this also mean the relationship between wisdom and ethics more generally? The Sutta states someone accomplishing good conduct knows and sees things as they really are. So in that case, when the Buddha pairs knowledge and conduct, vijja charana sampanno, in those contexts, the vijja is the knowing or the knowing and seeing, and the charana is the sila and samadhi. So charana in those contexts includes both bodily behavior as well as the insights and so on that arise from samadhi. So that's, in that case, knowledge includes knowing and seeing. Okay. Okay, Korakot, give us an essay on climate change. Excellent, thanks, Korakot. I will check that out. Okay, good. I just opened that link. I will read it later. Thank you for that. Okay. Venerable Adisira offers an empty square, and I think that is absolutely correct, Venerable. Pravin goes on with another question. Could you please elaborate more on the appeal to the wise as to what the wise consider blameworthy or unblameworthy, as in the Kalam Sutta? Would this be regarded as a normative standard of knowledge, or perhaps the inference drawn from how people we identify as wise or good behave, speak, or think or speak? Yeah, it's interesting because the wise, usually the Vinyu, you could translate it as the intellectuals, intelligentsia. I translate it as sensible people. And of course, it's quite subjective, right? The amount of, different people will perceive different people as being wise. But, there are also some, some criteria and some behaviors which we can identify. And one of the things that the Buddha always emphasized, as we saw with the Chunky Sutta, was to scrutinize those who we're going to take as being wise, to see, do they act in accordance with their beliefs? And, so to an extent, it's an inadequate or an incomplete assessment. You can't fully really know whether somebody's going to be wise, and you might be mistaken by that. Can be easily. I mean, it happens all the time. But generally speaking, if someone has knowledge of the area in which they're talking, if their claims are founded on reason, if they are not given to sort of extreme and wild statements, if they are humble and willing to admit when they're wrong, or willing to admit the limits of their knowledge, if they speak in a way which is compassionate and which is for the benefit of all, rather than arguing for their own point of view, or the point of view of a group that they belong to, and so on. So these are all some of the criteria that we can use for telling who the wise might be. But again, that's like one of the initial stages of understanding the wise, and then we can then start to apply it through our experience. Okay, Mitchell, is it right to interpret the Buddha thinks that all empirical knowledge and moral knowledge converges and eventually leads to the same single truth? Yeah, I mean, in terms of his goal, right? In terms of the goal of the Buddhist path, then yes. Obviously, not all forms of knowledge are within that framework. Now, oh, excellent. An extremely hard question. That's what I want to see. Thank you so very much. What is an early Buddhist response made by the Buddha to the philosophical claim exemplified by the pragmatists that truth does not converge? The pragmatists say that there is no way to touch some language of reality outside of contingent and historically situated human vocabularies. Okay. And I think that the Buddha would agree with that. And they say there is no objective truth and only contingent, historically situated and socially situated intersubjective agreement and solidarity. Can either side, those who think truth converges onto one and those who think truth does not converge to one, convince the other? Can a Buddhist view be made compatible with pragmatism somehow? I'm both a pragmatist and a Buddhist. I'm trying to navigate this disagreement about the nature of truth. I know many others trying to navigate similar. Okay, so how I would approach that would be to say the Buddha essentially was a pragmatist in his approach to truth. And this is why I expressed that caution about Jayatilleka's use of the word objective in that kind of sense. I think that's slightly overstating what you can infer strictly from the suttas. But to me, the key is that what the Buddha is talking about is the Four Noble Truths, which is a universal experience. So yes, it's true that in one way you can say these are purely subjective, but it's a subjective experience that everybody shares, because everybody shares the experience of suffering. Now, if you could imagine, for example, a alien species who lived in a world of unicorns and lollipops, and who just had only happiness and no suffering, then it would be hard to convince them of the Four Noble Truths. And I can imagine that, if I was to sort of emigrate to such a world as a Buddhist monk and think, oh, I'm going to go and spread the Dhamma to them, I'd get off the spaceship and I'd say, okay, guys, like everything's suffering, right? No, everything's lollipops and unicorns. No, that's all we have here. No, but like it's ultimately unsatisfying. And they'd be like, no, actually, it's pretty satisfying. We're actually pretty happy with our life here. No, you're not really happy with your lives there. And fortunately, I don't actually have this problem too much here on planet Earth, where that doesn't seem to be the case. But, you can imagine that if it was the case that there were beings who who did not experience suffering, then, yeah, maybe you could say the Buddha's teachings didn't apply to them. So that's again, an empirical claim that sentient beings do, in fact, experience suffering. So if that empirical claim is false, then, yeah, Buddha's teachings wouldn't apply. But as long as that holds good, then I think that's why I wouldn't call it an objective truth, but I'd say it's an intersubjective truth, but one which speaks to a universal aspect of experience that's shared among everybody. So I don't know if that's helpful for you, Mitchell, but anyway, that's how I look at that. All right. Is it true that some schools of Buddhism believe that even after the Parinibbana, the Buddhas come back to help humanity? How does this idea sit with the Bhavatanha? Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I think that there are some people who believe that for sure. And whether there are schools of Buddhism that teach that, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, look, I mean, the idea that the Buddha is coming back, obviously, he's not coming back. So if anyone does teach, that's not what the Buddha was teaching. One of the things that you find sometimes, without kind of wanting to get into it too much, but if you look into the development of philosophical interpretations of Dhamma, usually what you find is that there's some kind of like a two-pronged or dual kind of philosophical aspect which is developed. And if we look at it and we take one of those aspects, then it's very easy to misread what's happening, because the thing has evolved by trying to balance two different kinds of aspects. So in that particular case, let us assume, and I'm not saying this is the case, but let us assume that there is a school of Buddhism that says the Buddha exists eternally in his Parinibbana, okay? Then what we would tend to find in that same school they would also emphasize the teaching that that we find in the suttas, that the Tathagata, even here and now, cannot be grasped. You see, the Buddha, even here and now, is completely empty. He doesn't even really exist now, but he also kind of will exist eternally. So what do you actually mean when you say that he's existing eternally? Well, it all gets a bit complicated, doesn't it? It certainly doesn't mean that he exists eternally sitting on a throne in a heaven like you might imagine. But what it kind of means is it then refers back to those ideas that Jayatilleka referred to earlier. Whether the Tathagata appears or does not appear, then the reality of the Dhamma and the reality of dependent origination is still the same, because the Buddha is an embodiment of those things. So it's about the fact that at any time, Buddhahood is available and can be realized. So again, I can't, that's obviously would be a much bigger philosophical concept to have, but just to sort of bear in mind that when we see perspectives that on the one hand look as if they might be teaching something quite different from what we're used to hearing in Buddhism, that usually there's another side to that story as well. And so it's good to sort of listen and to try to apprehend both sides of that story, because that usually tells us something more interesting. All right. Venerable Karunika. The difference between inference, Paccavekkhana, and intuition. Oh dear. Well, inference, I talked about Paccavekkhana. Paccavekkhana is specifically like reviewing knowledge. So that's what happens after you know something. So usually, like for example, when I teach meditation, I always teach at the end of the meditation that people should review back even for a minute or two and check back on what's happened. And this is to train us in the habit of doing this Paccavekkhana jnana. And the same thing happens even if someone gets enlightened, for example. Maybe you have some experience, your mind is blown, defilements are all gone, and you think, wow, I've made it. This is it, right? But then you still do, well, just do the Paccavekkhana. Let's do the review, see what is there and what isn't there. Keep it going. Do I still feel the same the next week, the next month? And because these things sometimes take time to unfold. So Paccavekkhana is like a specific application of knowledge. It's a kind of anumana, right? It's a kind of inference that is applied retroactively. Intuition is, how do I put this? When we talk about intuition, I would class intuition also as an aspect of inference, but it specifically emphasizes that dimension of inference that emerges in a way that isn't obvious or can't be. It's not a kind of. It's not just a purely logical inference. It's a way that it appears like knowledge appears from the bottom of the well and it floats up and it's there and it has that quality of confidence and knowing to it. Okay, Pravin asks, read Turing's footnote. Would that mean that everyone but the Buddha is a computer? Crikey, probably not. I mean, I don't think that computers can even in principle be conscious, or at least I don't think that Turing machines can be conscious. I think that what we're doing with computers is something which is quite different, quite, you know, it's not like a computer is sort of 2% of the way to being conscious. I think it's doing something which is completely different and has nothing to do with consciousness. I don't want to get too far apart from the point, but I read one of the first original articles that I've read for years on the subject of AI a few weeks ago, and it was a very kind of powerful argument in favor of a Butlerian jihad. So those of you who are fans of Dune will remember that in the world of Dune, they made they got rid of all the AI. There's no computers anymore. And they did that because they regarded them as an abomination. And so this article was arguing that artificial intelligence or artificial sentience, more specifically artificial consciousness, was a moral abomination and shouldn't be allowed to exist in any form. And it was a really interesting read and really kind of provocative read. One of the points that he made is that let's assume that we can make a computer conscious. So I'm not talking here about AI like we have today, AI, which is just pattern recognition, but I'm talking about actually able to experience subjective experience in the same way that you or I might be able to experience it. Let's assume that we could make a computer do that. First of all, why would we do that? And he points out that the only conceivable reason why you would do that is to manufacture a slave. That's all we want. We want slaves. And so to do that is inherently immoral. The second thing that he pointed out was that we have no way of knowing what the nature of that computer's subjective experience is going to be. What if that artificial consciousness's subjective experience was nothing but a howling abyss of electronic madness? What if it was just being tortured with every moment? What if its experience was purely an experience of pain? How would we know that? Would we even know that it existed? We could be walking around with artificial consciousnesses on all of our phones, all of them screaming in agony, right? Like a person who's in a hospital, who's comatose, but inside they're suffering pain, but they've got no way of expressing it. We could have these in all of our computers and we would never know it. And if we asked that artificial intelligence whether you are suffering or not, how could we trust their answers? Because they would know that if we don't like the fact that they're suffering, we're just going to turn them off. Right? So they're going to lie to us for all we know. So when you start to think about this, it's horrible, isn't it? Right? We're going to invent all of these slaves who, for all we know, are just going to be experiencing all of this incredible agony and pain. And we'll never have any way of knowing, and we can multiply it to billions of these suffering consciousnesses just so that we can have our own slaves. So this is why, this is, I think, a really powerful argument, really worth thinking about. And this is why he concluded that we should have a Butlerian jihad, which basically is a complete annihilation of all of the any possible artificial consciousness. And Butler, by the way, was, I think, one of the original Luddites. And Mitchell, this came up in conversation today, is why I said that Luddites were cool, actually. Apparently what the Luddites really did was that they identified that some of the machinery and industrial machines were harming workers and were basically bad for life. And so they went in and got rid of them. They weren't sort of dogmatically opposed to any innovation, but they sort of recognized that technology, when it's used inappropriately, can be harmful. So that's not the real original Luddites. Anyway, so I'll just leave that for now. Leave that little nightmare with you for now. Okay, so Korakot asks, some schools talk about threefold kaya. So Sambhogha kaya and Dhammakaya still remain. Yeah. Again, that's in answer to Deepika's question earlier. So Vijita says, sometimes Dhammo has Rakati Dhammachari, that the Buddha exists after. Again, replying to that same question. I won't keep going that one because I want to look at some more of Jayatileka. Michael says, if the lack of 5 hindrances in someone's mind may be one possible precondition for seeing accurately, maybe that's what meant by some uses of wise in the suttas broadly. Generally speaking, yes. I mean, certainly the Buddha would be quite, I mean, if the idea that you can be wise and yet have your mind full of hindrances would be a contradiction in terms to the Buddha. So the hindrances are called the panya dubalikarana, those things that weaken wisdom. So Daniel said, I thought I was looking at a conscious computer now. I hope not. Okay, by the same, Anne mentions 2001. Yes, also, right? No, that's all right. Okay. So Korakot says, by the same logic, we have no way of knowing other people's subjective experience without telepathy. Kind of yes and no. I mean, that's obviously that's a difficult philosophical problem, and we can't sort of answer that in any absolute way. But obviously, we have more in common with each other. And that's not nothing, right? We're born, we have bodies, we have experiences, and we share so very much. And so there's all of these things which give us a ground for saying, well, other people appear to be conscious in the same way that we are, and that's probably how things actually are. So with a computer, it's much more difficult because there's much more distance in terms of the sort of material expression that they have. All right. So I will, excuse me just 1 second, I'm going to turn the light on. It's getting a little bit hard to read here. I'm going to read a few more paragraphs from Jayatileka. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to read as many as I wanted. So as I said before, Jayatileka moved on to discussing dependent origination. And his discussion is really interesting and worthwhile, but I won't repeat it there. But just to mention that his point here in the context of epistemology is that our inference, our drawing of a connection between one thing or another is based on this idea of causality. The idea one thing causes another, so therefore we can infer from one thing to another by observing the regular patterns. So notice how memory plays a role there. I mean, you can't observe repeating patterns without memory. Otherwise, it's just what's happening here. It's just this and this and this. It's your memory which tells you, oh, this happened before. Ah, this happened before. I acted out of craving and then I suffered. Ah, again, I acted out of craving. Again, I suffered. Ah, again, I acted out of craving. Again, I suffered. And you can do that usually many thousands of times, and then finally learn the lesson. And that's the inference. And so that's like, in a way, that's like your panindriya, like your capacity for wisdom, right? And this is what makes that distinction. Somebody who has a greater inherent panindriya or capacity for wisdom can learn from fewer examples. So they might do the same thing a few different times, repeat the pattern a few different times, and then draw the inference, and then they can let go. Whereas somebody whose wisdom is weaker will have to do it again and again and again and again and again and again and burn it. Okay. Jayatileka gives a few examples of the kinds of inference such as inferring about birth and death. Statements were not only justified on the basis of empirical evidence, but were rejected as false when they conflicted with what was empirically observed. For example, the statement held, this is paragraph 785, the statement held by certain recluses and Brahmins to the effect that so long as a person is young, one is endowed with intellectual capacity, but this is lost with old age. So this is what some people are saying. Thankfully, the Buddha said, no, this isn't true. So a bit of a relief there. So, and of course, you see plenty of examples. Anyway, so the point here is that we can test statements with regards to the evidence. Okay. Okay, so paragraph 786. Many of the doctrines of Buddhism are claimed to be inductive inferences based on the data of extrasensory perception. In this respect, extrasensory perception is treated at the same level as normal perception, and it is considered possible to make both valid and erroneous inferences on this data. It may be asked whether the claims to extrasensory perception belong to the mythical and miraculous element in the canon, and whether these claims were actually made by the Buddha and his disciples. There is reason to believe that these claims were actually made. There is no doubt that yoga practices prevailed among the thinkers of the Middle and Late Upanishads, the Jains, some of the Ajivikas, and the Buddhists. Claims of this kind were common to all these schools. They are not considered miraculous, but the result of the natural development of the mind in the Buddhist texts, and have a close connection with the central doctrines of Buddhism. That point being very important. If you want to try to dismiss the extrasensory perception, including things like recollection of past lives, and you have to account for the fact that these things are not merely mentioned in a peripheral or passing way, but have a close connection with the central doctrines like the Te Vidya. Some of these experiences, such as antenatal retrocognition, have been claimed by people under deep hypnosis. For others, such as telepathy and clairvoyance, it is believed that there is a certain amount of experimental data which tends to confirm the existence of such faculties. And so Jaitileka is pointing to the evidence from modern research, which tends to correlate with Buddhist ideas. And of course, since then, we have the research by Professor Stevenson. And for a survey of different kinds of research in different areas, I recommend the book Irreducible Mind, which has thousands of studies of these kinds of things. So, but again, notice Jaitileka's voice of caution here. He's not saying, therefore, the Buddha was right because these things have been proven. He's saying, well, these things are found in the suttas, and there are modern studies that seem to correlate with them. And, you know, we need to be humble in the kinds of conclusions that we make about these things. Okay. Jaitileka in paragraph 787 and 788 goes on to discuss questions about the Buddha's ability to predict the future. So the Buddha wasn't sort of endowed with some kind of knowledge where he could just know whatever was going to happen, but he did have an understanding of cause and effect. So he said things like, if I see a man proceeding in such and such a way, walking in such and such a direction, then I will know that if he continues in that way, he will reach such and such a town. And so this is the Buddha's knowledge of the karma and the results of karma. But it doesn't mean that he was able to just know everything that was going to happen in the future. Jaitileka goes on to discuss the Mahakamma Vibhanga Sutta. Again, without going into the details here, But in Mahakama Vibhanga Sutta, there are a number of examples which are worked out of somebody who may have some kind of extrasensory perception, but who draws an unwarranted inference from those things. For example, you might see somebody who does a certain deed, and then later on they get reborn in a certain realm. And you therefore conclude that everybody who does that deed will get reborn in that realm. So for example, somebody might steal something, and then after their death, they go to heaven. And you might conclude, well, if you just go and steal something, then you'll go to heaven. Yay, best of both worlds, right? So, and the Buddha said, well, yes, it's true, but karma is complicated because, maybe that person had many good deeds in their life that they did that made them go to heaven, and they did one bad deed, but that wasn't sufficient to overcome all of the good karma that they'd made. So the point here is not that these kinds of experiences are wrong or that we can't draw inferences from them, but that these kinds of experiences are exactly the same as any ordinary experience, that the experience itself can be valid, but how we infer from them has to be done with caution, it has to be done with restraint, and it has to be done to be open to the fact that there are different interpretations of things. And this is something which is almost always lost in this world of, once you start to go down this world of extrasensory perception and so on, people will make some kind of claim and that's just it. It just becomes that this is the reality. And there's so many stories like this. Just one story that I'll just relate briefly. There was a book that I read a number of years ago. It was actually in the library at Bodhinyana. And this fellow he was just a journalist, an English journalist, I think. And he got interested in these like seances and these kinds of things. And he was originally just doing an article. So he was just doing an article on people who, commune with spirits from beyond the grave. So it's a good article. And so the more he got to know these people, the more that he got drawn into it, because there's so many things that they said that were really accurate. And he went to extreme lengths to try to verify things. And so the spirit was speaking through this woman, and they told a detailed story of a particular RAF squadron in World War II, and the people in that squadron, their names, and the details of of a time when they had to shift from one base to another, and they walked across the countryside, they camped in a particular school ground, and all of these things that happened, and all of these incredible details. And he went and researched it, and he found that he couldn't find any, he could correlate some of it, but much of it he couldn't correlate from any of the history books. There was nothing was recorded. And he could only find the still living pilots who had been part of that squadron and interviewed them. And when he interviewed them, they correlated every detail that had been said in this seance. They said, yes, we went on this journey. Yes, we stopped there. We stopped at this schoolyard. These people were there. And all of these things, none of which are found in any books, were all true. So that's kind of convincing, right? That's kind of, there's something going on. How are you doing this? Then as he stayed there longer, he began to get more and more caught up in the whole thing, and with the people and the community and all of the kind of the cultish ideas and this being or whatever it was that was possessing this woman would be kind of sometimes act in a very unwholesome way, like sometimes say things that might be, bitchy or gossipy, dividing people up or something like that. And then they tested them some more, and they got another story from them, and they went and tested this story, and it was all wrong. None of the details added up. The things that they talked about weren't there. They just weren't real. And so that, to me, was a sort of great example of exactly this kind of thing, that sometimes there can be, whatever it is, and I don't know, and I don't have any opinion, but there was something that was going on where somebody was able to know something that they shouldn't. And yet, that doesn't mean that everything they say is true. It doesn't mean they say everything is reliable. And it means we still have to test. Even if somebody might be right with one thing, they can still easily be wrong with something else. All right. Moving ahead. 790. Seven to eight. Okay. So in paragraph 797, Jayati Lekha talks about the way of verifying the Four Noble Truths. And of course, the way of verifying the Four Noble Truths is to live and to practice the Eightfold Path and practice the gradual training. It means to actually put these things into a practice that has a certain context. And this, I think, also is something which is really important, that we can't divorce knowledge from context. Again, this is something that happens a lot in like social media and so on, often to hilarious result. If you've followed on Twitter, for example, there is a whole kind of genre of tweets where people have been like, well, you don't understand this, you know, you need to read this book. And then the person responds by saying, well, if you check the authors, you realize I'm actually one of the authors of that book. So, and this actually happens, like there's quite a number of times. Somebody even did it to the Pontifex Twitter account, who made a pronouncement on something and then said, no, that's not true, read the Bible, mate. And then somebody replied, you're actually telling the Pope to read the Bible? And so this is where there's some kind of context to knowledge, so that opinions and ideas aren't just kind of divorced from that. So in Buddhism, that context is the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path. And this is what gives knowledge some kind of meaning and some kind of resonance. All right, running out of time rather predictably here. Jayati Lekha continues or returns to the question of the limits of knowledge and points out that the Buddha claimed to realize the threefold knowledge, the recollection of past lives, the divine eye, and the ending of the defilements. Obviously, there are other kinds of knowledge which the Buddha talked about in the suttas, but they are knowledges of a similar sort. And we don't find the Buddha making blanket claims to knowing everything. And in fact, of course, there are some things the Buddha said are unknowable. The first origins of samsara are unknowable. Other things which, like the unanswered questions, which are either unknowable or whose answers are meaningless. And this returns to one of the themes with which we opened this series, and that idea that any true path of knowledge must have an acknowledgement of the limits of that knowledge. No way of knowing is going to be without such limits. And so that acknowledgement by the Buddha is not a weakness of the Buddhist tradition, but it's an essential part of what makes knowledge possible. Okay. And finally, I'm just going to read the last paragraph 817. From paragraph 816. Jayati Lekha notes that many of the unanswered questions appear to be discarded on the grounds that they were logically meaningless, which resembles the solution of the logical positivist for such questions. It is necessary, however, to draw a distinction between the solution of the logical positivist and that of the Buddhist. Logical positivist, of course, being one of the schools of philosophy in mid-20th century in Europe. The Buddhist, while saying that it is meaningless to ask whether one exists or does not exist, or is born or is not born in Nibbana, still speaks of such a transcendent state as realizable. The meaninglessness of these questions is thus partly due to the inadequacy of the concepts contained in them to refer to this state. This is clearly brought out in a verse in the Sutta Nipata. The Buddha was asked the question, the person who has attained the goal, does he not exist, or does he exist eternally without defect? Explain this to me as you understand it. The Buddha explains the person who has attained the goal is without measure, napamanamati. He does not have that with which one might speak of him. Yenanang vajutang dastanati. The trans-empirical, a word that Jayati Lekha is introducing here, the trans-empirical cannot be empirically described or understood, but it can be realized and attained. The Tathagata, freed from the conception of form, sensation, ideas, dispositions, and consciousness, is said to be deep, immeasurable, and unfathomable like the great ocean, whereof one can speak of him that he does not have, yena nangwajutang tasanati, and hence one has to be silent. In this respect alone, it resembles the positivist's outlook, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. One of Wittgenstein's most famous sayings. This attitude has, however, to be distinguished from agnosticism. It is not that there was something that the Buddha did not know, but what he knew in the transcendent sense could not be conveyed in words because of the limitations of language and of empiricism. So this is Jayatileka's final paragraph, one which famously was criticized by his student, Kalapahana, who basically said that after doing this whole book on empiricism, Jayatileka sort of fell on this sort of quasi-metaphysical interpretation of Nibbana right at the end. And I agree with Kalapahana there. I think that Jayatileka's statements on Nibbana, I mean, it's brief, right? And he's just introducing a few ideas without too much sort of justification for them. But I think if we look at the way that the Buddha described Nibbana and talked about it, the primary description is Nibbana is the ending of greed, hate, and delusion. And the ending of greed, hate, and delusion is, or the ending of suffering. And these things are just as much an empirical reality as anything else might be. So to say that there are limits in how we can describe that state or how we can describe somebody who's in that state is one thing, but that doesn't necessarily imply that the state itself is some kind of trans-empirical reality, which Jayatileka is pointing to there. Okay, so it's now 5 o'clock. Panyadeepa has given us a summary of the prequels of Dune. Humans fought back. Okay, some human leaders later on after we can originally pose the jihad to exploit. Right. Yeah. Okay, so thank you for that. Thank you for that plot summary of the Butlerian jihad. In the book, Dune is only kind of referred to, but obviously there are prequels there. So, I mean, this is one of the things which, you know, in science fiction and so on, people speculate about it because the point of science fiction is to look at the human implications of the development of different technologies and to cause us to reflect more deeply on what these things might mean. Okay, good. So I think that's probably about it for now. And we've reached the end of this course.